Freud is born in 1856. 3 years later, 1859, Darwin publishes The Origin of Species. This is crucial to know about Freud. Freud grows up under the aegis of Darwinism. And it's not just Darwinism as we know it today, it's ideological Darwinism. These guys were passionate. They were done with religion. Man is an animal. Man must be studied as an animal. There will be no talk about souls and spirits. There will be no teleology. There will be a rigorous causal explanatory approach to man as an animal organism. And so Freud initially is thinking of law and politics, but there's an interesting tale there. He hears a poem when he's about 16, a poem that was wrongly attributed to Goethe. I think it was Schiller. It's called Ode to Nature. And Freud is so inspired by this celebration of nature that he decides that he wants to be a natural scientist. What was it about the poem that inspired him? Because in the poem, nature is depicted as a mother, Mother Nature, who allows her secrets to be explored by her favorite son, science. Now, how's that for an Oedipal twist? Mother allows her secrets to be explored. This inspires Freud, who, by the way, had a doozy of an Oedipus complex. Old father who was like 40 when Freud was born, young mother who was like 20. So there's an Oedipal quality to scientific inspiration, exploring the secrets of nature. Anyway, Freud drops his interest in law and politics and decides to become a natural scientist. He has no desire to be a doctor, wants to be a research scientist. He starts working in the lab of Ernst von Brücke, who was part of what was known as the Helmholtz school of physiologists. And as I say, these people were passionate Darwinists. Man is an animal and will be studied as such. He idealized von Brücke. He wanted to be a professor of physicalistic physiology in the University of Vienna. These guys were passionate reductionists. Everything is reduced to the biological. Materialists. One day, after years of working under von Brücke, cutting up eels, he'd be walking around Vienna carrying buckets of eels because he was dissecting eels to understand the nervous system of eels. Von Brücke comes to him and says, young man, you've been engaged for years. I know you want a professorship. It isn't going to happen. You're a Jew. This is Vienna. You're not. He wasn't personally anti-Semitic, von Brücke. He was just telling this young man the facts. And so Freud realizes his hopes of a professorship research in physiology are dead. So what's he going to do? He feels forced to take a medical degree. He's not really interested. He has no interest in curing. You have to understand, Freud was all about knowing, not about curing. But he had to do something, so in order to do a medical degree, you have to choose a specialty. What's he going to specialize in? Well, he's been studying the nervous system of eels, so he figures he may as well do neurology, diseases of the nervous system. So that's what he does. And he starts to practice neurology. But I don't know the precise proportion, but a heck of a lot of the people, once he hung out his shingle, who showed up in his waiting room, had nothing neurologically wrong with them. Why were they there? Because they were nervous. And so they thought it made sense to go to a nerve specialist. But there was nothing wrong with their nervous system. They might have been having nervous breakdowns, but there was nothing neurological. And that's an interesting paradox. We look at the word neurosis. Now, neurosis is a word that contains neuro, but it means there's nothing neuro wrong with you. But the word neuro is still built into the very word Freud didn't have much to offer these people, but he was incredibly curious. He didn't just throw them. A lot of physicians at the time just said, time wasters, hysterics, get the hell out of my office. But Freud was curious about what was driving these people. And he hears about Charcot in Paris using hypnosis with hysterics. 3 types of hysteria: conversion hysteria, phobia, anxiety hysteria. Anxiety hysteria is now known as panic attacks. In anxiety hysteria, the hysteria comes out of the blue. Patient can't make sense as to why they're having this anxiety attack. Phobia, you identify a specific irrational fear, spiders, heights. But Freud was mostly studying conversion hysteria. The classic example of conversion hysteria is the famous glove anesthesia. The hand is paralyzed, but the paralysis ends at the wrist. If it were a real paralysis, it would follow the actual nerve pathways, but it doesn't. It follows the concept of the hand, not the actual nerve pathways. There's a lot of confusion between conversion hysteria and psychosomatics. I don't know why people get confused. It's very simple. Conversion is really all in your head. I mean, it employs the body, but it's a drama of the body. It's a theater of the body. The paralysis isn't real. In psychosomatic illness, you have real medical illness. You have tissue changes. You have oozing rashes. You have things that show up on x-rays and real physical illness that is believed to have a psychological cause. The psyche is involved. Mind you, many people will say the psyche is always involved in any illness, but the illnesses that are designated psychosomatic are ones where there is recognized to be a strong psychological, emotional element in the illness. And of course, there are illnesses there are problems that are hard to sort out. Is this hysteria? Is this psychosomatic? I mean, there are borderline cases that are very hard to sort out. Charcot is doing direct hypnotic suggestion. He's hypnotizing the patient and telling them when they come out, their paralysis will be gone. He's also taking non-neurotic people, non-hysterical people, students, who volunteer to be hypnotized. So Freud, von Brucke was guilty, so he gets a travel grant, which enables Freud to spend 6 months in Paris. And he learns from Charcot that you can create hysteria in otherwise normal people using hypnosis. And you can cure hysteria through words alone. What a strange condition this is that can be created and cured through words alone. So Freud really notes that. Another thing he notes under Charcot, one night at a dinner party at Charcot's, after the women have withdrawn to the drawing room and the guys loosen their ties and they pull out the brandy and they light up the cigars, and Charcot has had a few. Freud hears him saying, toujours, toujours, in these cases of hysteria, there's always something in the bedroom. Something is either happening or not happening in the bedroom. And Freud doesn't know what to make of this, but he files it away. He then gets a second travel grant, and he goes back to Nancy, where he observes Bernheim, another person who's using hypnosis. And he takes a student, asks for a volunteer, and the student volunteers, and Bernheim hypnotizes him, and then Bernheim tells him when he comes out of the trance he'll not remember anything, and Bernheim will go on with the lecture, but at a certain point Bernheim will do something like maybe tug on his earlobe, and then the student will do something bizarre, like get up and go to the cloakroom and bring back his umbrella and put it up or whatever. And he goes ahead and he does this, and then Bernheim interrupts the lecture and goes up to the student and says, "Young man, why are you doing this bizarre thing?" And the student doesn't know. Bernheim starts pressuring him, and the student starts coming up with obviously irrational explanations. We know why he's doing it. But when he badgers him enough, the student starts remembering, well, you told me to do this. So Freud files that away. Sometimes when you persistently pressure someone, something that was unconscious to them can become conscious. And he files that away. A little later, he hears another Viennese physician, Krobach, who had been treating hysterics for years, and they're dressing in the men's locker room before a formal dinner, and Krobach says to Freud something quite sexist, but nevertheless, if I wrote on my prescription pad the prescription for these hysterical women, I would write penis normalis docim repetitor, a normal penis applied repetitively. And so Freud puts that with the toujours, the bedroom, you know, sex again. Then there's the story of Joseph Breuer, another senior Viennese physician who's been treating, neurologist who's been treating hysterics with direct hypnotic suggestion, and gradually Breuer starts telling him the story of Breuer's treatment of Anna O, as she's called in the book, The Studies on Hysteria. This took place 10 years earlier. Freud did not treat Anna O, whose real name was Bertha Pappenheim. And Breuer was doing direct hypnotic suggestion with her until one day, after putting her into trance, she interrupted him before he could plant the post-hypnotic suggestion. And she just started talking. And Breuer let her go. And he listened, and invariably the story went back to some traumatic scene, some traumatic memory. We're not talking here about a memory from childhood. We're talking about a more recent trauma situation. And she would then remember this trauma, and she would remember it with feeling, and she would have an emotional catharsis, and then she would come out of the trance. There's no post-hypnotic suggestion here, and the symptoms would be gone. But in all of these methods, I forgot to mention the main problem, which is symptom substitution. This is no lasting cure. The next day, the same symptom is back, or it's moved to a different arm or a different leg, and Freud is pretty unhappy with this hypnosis. Well, no wonder. He was inspired to be a scientist. And here he is with a watch saying, your eyes are growing heavy, and, and even if it worked, he would have hated it, because it would only have been a cosmetic treatment. It would have made the problem go away, but Freud was not interested in making problems go away. He was interested in what's the meaning of the problem in the first place. So hypnosis was very unsatisfactory as far as he was concerned. Finally, in 1893, he and Joseph Breuer, Breuer has not told him the whole story of Anna O, his work with Anna O. I'll just fill in. Breuer is she's a beautiful young woman. He's a handsome older Viennese physician, and he's seeing her almost every day. He's at her bedside hypnotizing her. His wife is getting antsy. And he decides it's time to break off this treatment. And he tries to break it off, and that night her servants are pounding on the door saying she's in a crisis, you must come. He goes to her bedside and finds her in a state of pseudocyesis, hysterical pregnancy, and to his horror, she thinks it's Joseph Breuer's baby that she's giving birth to. So he panics at this point, grabs his wife, and they go off to the continent for somewhere for a vacation. She winds up in a bin, in a loony bin, where she becomes addicted to all kinds of drugs. But over the next 10 years, a number of devoted psychiatrists managed to help her overcome the addiction. She gets her life together and becomes one of Europe's first leading feminist social workers. She had nothing to do with Freud. This is all Breuer, see, before. And the story is leaking out because clearly Breuer is very nervous about something. And I frankly don't believe that many hysterical women think they're having a doctor's baby unless something funny has gone on between that doctor and that woman. Well, I have no evidence for this, okay? This is my private hypothesis, but anyway, that's the story. So in 1893, they decide to write up what they've learned from their work using hypnosis with hysterics, and this results in the thing called the preliminary communication, which is signed by both of them. And then in 1895, 2 years later, they bring out the book, Studies on Hysteria, which is a very weird book because only one chapter of the book is signed by both of them. Every other chapter is signed either Breuer or Freud. So they're already disagreeing. And what are they disagreeing? Well, first of all, in the part that they agree about, what they're saying is that hysteria is due to trauma, traumatic scenes, forgotten memories of trauma. Forgotten memories of trauma. But they're already disagreeing because Breuer is thinking that these traumatic scenes have become forgotten accidentally. The patient was in a peculiar mental state that he called a hypnoid state, and the trauma just sort of slipped into the unconscious accidentally. And Freud is saying, no. These traumatic scenes are actively and intentionally repressed, pushed into the unconscious because they're painful. So they're disagreeing on this. Second big disagreement is Freud is zeroing in that the traumas are sexual. Toujours, Krobach, the traumas are sexual, and this is making Breuer really nervous. 1896, the year after the book is published, Freud delivers a lecture to the Medical Society of Vienna in which he announces that I, Sigmund Freud, have discovered the cause of hysteria. It is the sexual seduction, that's his word, the sexual seduction of the child by an adult, could be an older sibling, the father, the man next door, whatever. The cause of neurosis. This is a very unpopular theory. A lot of the senior physicians sitting in the audience have hysterical daughters. So it's as if Freud is calling them perverts. So this is a very unpopular theory. And within a year, Freud is having major doubts about the theory. And of course, Jeffrey Mason, who was here in Toronto for a while, writes a book called The Assault on Truth, and he and a few others argued that Freud had the truth there in 1896, but he was too ambitious to hold on to the truth. He realized he was going to get ridden out of town on a rail rather than have a nice career if he hung on to this theory of sexual abuse, which he wasn't calling abuse, he was calling seduction, which makes it sound like the older man is kind of nice to the little girl, seducing her. But at least he was recognizing, the incestuous or the element. He's not calling it abuse. Okay, so Mason and others, Alice Miller, others, they imply that the trauma theory, the so-called seduction theory, was correct. Freud begins to doubt it. He begins to think that he was naive to believe all these stories. He never denied that some of the stories were true. He acknowledged that some of these stories of abuse were true. But he proceeded to radically revise the theory. And he's been accused of cowardice, ambition, blah, 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 blah. Which to my mind is all nonsense. Because the theory had to be radically revised because the theory wasn't true. It's that simple. There are many children who've been sexually abused who do not become hysterics. And there are many hysterics who have never been sexually abused. So the theory that hysteria is caused by sexual abuse is just invalid. So Freud had to radically revise it. Now, in revising it, however, he goes overboard. Now, this is, Hegel says all of history and all of philosophy develops by, like these pendulum swings. We go from thesis, and then when we see that thesis is wrong, we swing all the way to antithesis, and maybe if we're lucky, we eventually get to a synthesis. So here's like a pendulum thing. So here is the first theory, the so-called seduction theory, which is a theory of abuse. And this is the external world. And so what Freud is saying here is that neurosis is caused by external factors, environmental factors. And what are the factors? Perverse adults abusers, adult perverts who abuse children. That's his first theory. Now, when he sees that that isn't exactly true, he swings all the way over to the other side and finds the cause of neurosis entirely in the inner world, not in the outer world. And the pervert now is the child. This is the theory of infantile sexuality. The child is polymorphous perverse, deriving pleasure oral, anal, phallic, wherever, whole body. The child is incestuous. The child doesn't recognize the animal-human boundary. We've got a perverted child now. We had perverted adults. Where did the fantasies of seduction or abuse come from? From the child's Oedipus complex. The child desired the parent. This generated a fantasy of sex with the parent. And these stories were fed to Freud, and he believed them. The damage that this did, a lot of damage. Because like generations of Freudian analysts are sitting there listening to women patients tell them about having been abused. And because they've been educated by Freud here, they're saying, well, my dear, it doesn't really matter what really happened. It's what you imagine or what you feel or what you think happened that really counts. And these women are already confused because they don't know, they're not clear in their own minds whether they've been abused or they haven't, and now they've got the doctor saying, suggesting, implying that it doesn't matter and it's probably a fantasy anyway. It's did a lot of harm. Freud begins to, at this time, he goes in, well, his discovery that his first theory was wrong threw him into a crisis. How could I have been so naive? How could I have been so wrong? And he's feeling humiliation. And he goes into a self-analysis. He has a bit of a neurotic breakdown himself. He begins to study his own dreams. Many people call this a creative illness. The whole of psychoanalysis came out of this self-analysis that he went into between 1897 and 1900. In 1900, he produces his masterpiece, the Interpretation of Dreams. And many of the dreams in that book that are attributed to his patients are his own dreams. And so he's in a crisis. And he's asking himself, how could I have been so ready to believe these stories? Many of which turn out to be not true. Well, he traces this to his own Oedipus complex. At age 3, the family moved from Freiburg in Moravia, part of Czechoslovakia, to Vienna. Freud is 3, and he's in a train compartment with his mother, and the train pulls into Strasbourg. The station is lit up by gas lamps. Freud is asleep. He wakes up, and the compartment is lit up by the gas lights in the station, and there's his mother naked, having disrobed, his 23-year-old mother, and then the door to the next compartment opens, and this old gray-haired guy, old enough to be his grandfather, but it's his father, comes and takes her by the hand and takes her away to do God knows what with her in the next compartment. And Freud's jealous and hostile to the old man, and here's the Oedipus complex. And so Freud is saying, why was I so ready to believe that all my female patients were sexually abused by their fathers? Because of my hatred of my father as the abuser of my mother. I'm ready to hate fathers. I haven't been able to forgive my father for taking my mother away from me. So he traces it to his own Oedipus complex. And it's about this time that he sees a performance of Oedipus Rex. And he watches the people stumbling out of the theater, white-faced, shaking. Such a powerful drama. He says, why does this drama have such an impact on people around the world for centuries? Because at one point we were all, he says, a little Oedipus, as he certainly was. He believed that the Oedipus complex is universal, And in fact, I believe he's right. And at some point later, I'll get into the argument as to why he's right. But he's right in a very modified way. But he's still kind of right that it is universal, the Oedipus complex, between 2.5 to 5 years of age. Anyway, he goes overboard here, and he quickly begins to realize he's gone overboard, and he starts to inch back. He realizes he's thrown external reality out, but on the other hand, it was a creative error because it put internal psychic reality on the map. Before that, reality really referred to the external world. Freud is discovering an internal world here, an internal world of fantasy and wish and desire and illusion. He puts that on the map, but he overdoes it so that he loses the external reality, and he's now trying to bring it back. So by I think it's 1911, he wrote a paper called Two Principles of Mental Functioning, the pleasure principle, but the reality principle. And he's beginning to talk about the ego and its function of reality testing, distinguishing between fact and fiction, hallucination and reality. He's trying to bring reality back in. Certainly the whole development of his ego psychology is all about trying to find a middle ground. So here's the hypothetical middle ground, a position that we are still groping for, which does justice to both the external world and the internal world. Because children have real trauma, there is real abuse, there is real deprivation, all of which has incredibly important effects on the growing psyche, and we need to understand that. But children also have little psyches that are irreducible to the external world. The psyche is not just a mirror of external reality. Children are little sexual investigators. Children form theories. They form fantasies. And you can't always believe what children say to you. You can't disbelieve them, because sometimes they're telling the truth. But you can't just believe them either, because sometimes they're lost in fantasies. So you can't believe them. You can't disbelieve them, because sometimes they're telling the truth. There's this terrible problem of discernment, sorting out what's true and what's not true, and what a kid is saying to you. So Freud is trying to find this middle ground. Now, this here at the bottom, the analyst Bertrand Levine came up with this brilliant metaphor. He said, imagine a projection screen which is not completely translucent like glass, but it's not completely opaque either. It shows light through, and it's having two different films projected onto the same screen from different sides of the screen. So this film is projecting something like Casablanca, this projector is projecting Casablanca, this projector is projecting Gone with the Wind. So what you see on the screen is a crazy mixture of Casablanca and Gone with the Wind. And that is his metaphor for what psychic reality is like. It's a crazy mixture of what comes in from the external world and what the child's own mind and the child's own desires and fears and fantasies do to that. So part of the work of analysis is sorting out what came from the outer, what came from the inner. Understanding that the mind is a kind of a transformer. It transforms things. It alters them. It elaborates. It edits. And we it's not till the very, I think it's Capers is the analyst who a lot of the Lacanians, I guess, have made this point, but Capers makes the point very clearly that it's not towards the end of a long analysis that the analyst and the patient can have any idea of what their childhood really was like. Because it's only after the patient's tendencies to distort have been sorted out in the transference. We can see his tendency to distort by the way he distorts interactions between him and me. Not that I'm always in touch with reality. Sometimes I, the analyst, am doing the distorting. And sometimes the patient is is helping me correct my distortions. So I'm not saying that the analyst is sitting there with the key to reality, and helping the patient sort out the distortions. There's distortions on both sides, but the analytic process can be seen as working towards removing these distortions. And like by the end of the analysis, you now have got some sense of the patient's characteristic ways of distorting, and therefore the ways in which they probably distorted what was going on with mother and what was going on with father. And we can begin to get a sense of what their childhood might really have been like, although we can never know. Okay, so Freud goes overboard and he tries to come back. When Freud swings to the Oedipus complex and to the internal world, this is the origin of so-called drive theory. And mainstream, certainly Freudian analysis has remained heavily, and this is a big part of Freudian psychoanalysis, drive theory. Okay, first of all, let's deal with the translation issue. Freud did not use the German word instinct, which is spelt with a K, I-N-S-T-I-N-K-T in German. He did not use that word. That word means animal instinct, like the salmon's instinct to swim upstream, the bear to hibernate. He knew he wasn't talking about that. He used the German word Trieb, T-R-I-E-B, which James Strachey, his translator, should have translated with the word drive, but instead Strachey translated it with the English word instinct, thus making Freud look far more like an instinctivist, a biological reductionist than he really is, if you read him in the German. But a lot of people have overworked this Strachey bashing. Strachey did make it look worse, but there's a problem anyhow. Freud's clearest statement of what he means by drive is in his essay, I think again, 1911 or something around there, 1909 maybe. Instincts and their vicissitudes is the way Strachey translates it. It should have been called Drives and Their Vicissitudes. And it's in that essay that he defines the drive, the human drive, as composed of four elements: an aim, an object, a pressure, and a source. And he acknowledges that the human drives differ from animal instincts, especially in regard to the aim and the object. Whereas the aim and the object are built into the animal instinct. They are added on, there's a great deal of openness to learning, they can be shifted around, they can be reversed, they can be displaced, so that my aim might originally be a voyeuristic aim to look, but I can switch that into a wish to be looked at. I can switch voyeurism into exhibitionism and the other way around. My wish to penetrate can be reversed into a wish to be penetrated. So the aims are very open to change, learning, influence. The objects are also not hardwired. They're equally open to being displaced, shifted around. So my incestuous libidinal interest in my mother, I shift to my beloved kindergarten teacher, and I've got a major crush on her. I've shifted my incestuous object from mother to a non-incestuous object. Pressure. Anyone who looks at newborn babies in a nursery sees that they all have different personalities from day one, or not personalities, that's too strong a word, temperaments. They have different temperaments. Some are quiet, they have a suck, they go to sleep, others are raging. The pressure of the drives has something constitutional about it and biological, and Freud recognizes that. But here comes the problem part, the fourth. The drives are all rooted in a somatic source. They bubble up from the body. And in regard to sexuality, people often think, well, this kind of corresponds with what is commonly thought, that our sexuality somehow bubbles up from our genitals, our gonads, erogenic zones of the body. That makes sense, but Freud was honest enough to admit he could never identify the bodily zone from which the aggressive drive bubbled up. And that, of course, should have made him question the whole idea of the drives as bubbling up from the body in the first place. Unfortunately, it did not cause him to junk the whole idea. So he is pinning our drives, and these drives, what he means are motives. What motivates human behavior? And for him, there are the two broad classes of motives, sex and aggression. These are the prime categories of human motives, and they originate in the body. That is, they originate in the animal part of man, not from the cortex. Now, I would make the case that this is totally wrong about human sexuality. Human sexuality involves the cortex big time. It's about fantasies, stories, perfume, garter belts, whatever. And it trickles down from the mind to the body. I mean, it employs the body as a vehicle. It employs the body as a prop with which to enact a sexual drama. I mean, human sexuality is dramaturgical. Scenarios, stories, plot lines, imagery. But for Freud, it bubbles up from the body. Aggression bubbles up from the body, from the animal element. So we're back here now to the von Brucke, man is an animal. And the result of this is that we can describe Freudian theory as a psychobiology. Freudian theory is a psychobiological theory. The psycho part is what he will later call superego and ego. Superego being morality, ego being rationality. He's echoing Plato here, by the way. Plato gave us the metaphor of the rider and the horse. Well, for Freud, the superego is morality, the ego is reason, but they're attached to this horse, the body, appetite for Plato. And that's why man is in conflict. Freud's vision of man in conflict is that we will be forever in conflict with ourselves because we are human superegos and egos forever attached to an animal id. And ultimately animal id. And therefore we're in conflict, and we always will be. I remember Charles Brenner in New York at the Waldorf 25 years ago, 30 years ago, when he came out with his book Mind in Conflict, and he was talking about how the drives cannot be altered, really. They can be sublimated and transformed a little bit, but they can't, I shouldn't say altered. Yes, they can be altered. They can be redirected. They can be sublimated, but they can't be eradicated. And so what is therapy for Charles Brenner? It's coming up with better defenses. The patient enters treatment because their defenses against their unacceptable sexual and aggressive urges are too costly, breaking down, causing too much trouble. What is the analysis? It helps the person work out better defenses. But there's no way that if, so I got up and asked him, and a couple of people got up and asked him, but is there no possibility that my Oedipal hatred of my father, that I could let go of it? That I could get past it? Not for Brenner. The Oedipus complex, the hatred of the father is just a fact. You can work out better defenses, but you can't alter that Oedipal hostility. You fundamentally can't alter your incestuous longing for a mother. These are things that are just part of our built-in, because it comes from the id, from this animal bodily part of us. I believe this to be fundamentally wrong. I believe these deep passions can often be significantly, I believe that people can sometimes forgive their parents. Sometimes this happens in a good analysis. My first and best analyst, Robin Hunter, wrote a paper on forgiveness. He was pretty Freudian, but he wrote a paper on forgiveness, but not for Brenner. So we're dealing with this psychobiological. So this is a dualistic conception of human nature, and our Western culture is filled with dualism. Everybody blames René Descartes, who really put the idea of a subject separated from an object on the map. And so we have mind-body split. We have the split between culture and nature. And this split, this Cartesian split, is, I believe, and I believe this along with Pope Francis and many other thinkers, that this is the root of our ACD, anthropogenic climate disruption. It's really rooted in this Cartesian thinking that separates mind from nature. And Freud, in some ways Freud transcends this, in other ways he reflects it. This is, how does he transcend it? Well, his whole notion of psychosomatics transcends it. The mind affecting the body and making the body sick. That's in a certain way an overcoming of mind-body dualism. But here he's reflecting this dualism between mind and body. And of course, what he's doing is blaming human evil on the animal in man. And we all do this. We call Paul Bernardo a beast. Well, would that he were a beast, because beasts don't behave that way. Beasts kill in order to survive and protect their young. They don't make movies of the rape, humiliation, and murder of their victims for future enjoyment. They don't design death camps. They don't bomb 2 cities without giving the Japanese a chance to observe a test on an uninhabited atoll. Human beings do these things. So Freud has got it profoundly backwards here about human evil, which he naturalizes, when in fact human evil is a distinctively, uniquely human phenomenon. You have to be able to empathize, to put yourself in the other person's shoes, in order to design diabolical, humiliating tortures. Only if you can put yourself empathically in another person's shoes. Empathy is not sympathy. Empathy is a cognitive act of knowing how you feel. And I have to be able to do that in order to enjoy my sadistic treatment of you. If I can't know how you feel, I can't enjoy my sadism. Okay? People confuse sympathy with empathy all the time. These are 2 very different things. A sympathetic person empathizes, knows how you feel, but then he takes a second step. He cares, and he wants to help. That's sympathy. But this blaming of human evil on the beast, on the animal, it's incorrect. Psychoanalysis goes off the rails here in a serious way, it seems to me. But on the other hand, what's really positive here is Freud brings this idea of the mind in conflict. It was Ernst Kreis, sometime in the 1930s, who defined psychoanalysis as the, underline, the psychology of the innermost operations, I think, of the human mind in conflict. And then Brenner writes a book called The Mind in Conflict, in which he pretty much defines psychoanalysis as the mind as conflict. So Karl Marx is the conflict theorist of society, and Sigmund Freud is the conflict theorist of the mind. And he brilliantly explores mental conflict. I say he's wrong to anchor this conflict in the body versus the mind. But insofar as he sees the mind itself as in conflict, that's a hugely important and true contribution. So let me just flip for a second to comparing Freud's fundamental model of human nature to Melanie Klein's, because I think Melanie Klein really makes the breakthrough. Klein is also a conflict theorist, but for her, she doesn't attack Freud's theory of the bodily origins. She doesn't attack Freudian drive theory. She just makes it mean something else. A drive for Klein is a fantasy. in order to placate Freud, she'll say that the fantasies are the mental representations of the drive. Freud always says that the drive is only known in the mind through its mental representations. And so Klein starts out saying that. But before long, Klein and the Kleinians have dropped the body altogether. And they're talking about the fantasies that make up the human mind. And they are fantasies of two fundamental kinds. They are loving fantasies and they are hateful fantasies. And so here's Melanie Klein's depiction of human nature, of our human problem. The problem isn't our minds versus our bodies. The problem is in our minds and hearts, where we are torn by our love on one hand and our hate on the other. So Klein is, just like Freud, a conflict theorist, but she has conceived the conflict in psychological terms. So Freud is doing psychobiology. Klein is doing psychology. Okay? But again, it's a concept of the mind in conflict. And how do we cope with conflicts? And here, Freud contributes this brilliant idea of the compromise formation. Our minds are a whole system of conflict, of compromises. Now, I don't like the word compromise because it sounds too rational, as if id, ego, and superego sit around a table and hammer out a compromise. That's not really what happens. What he really means is a compound, like a chemical compound, like H2O, 2 hydrogen, 1, a blend. He's talking about blends or alloys or compounds. Our behavior, clashing forces come together and we get a third thing, which is irreducible to either of the two components that went into it, but gives both of those components some element of satisfaction. The id gets some satisfaction, the superego gets some satisfaction, the ego plays a role. And so we have these compounds. 2 years ago, my colleague Andrew Brooke, professor of philosophy at Ottawa, at the meetings of the Canadian, he gave a really interesting paper called Freud and Brentano. Brentano was a distinguished Viennese philosopher, and Freud attended all of his lectures. Freud idealized, like Freud is 19, and he idealizes this older, successful philosopher, well-to-do, big home. Freud is invited to dinner parties there. He writes in his diaries, Brentano is the most beautiful, the most brilliant, whatever. He wants Brentano to supervise his doctoral thesis, and he takes every one of Brentano's courses. And Brentano is teaching Kant. He's obviously teaching Hegel. Hegel was all over the place. Suddenly, Freud drops. We never hear of Brentano again in the whole of Freud's writings. We don't know what happened. It's a mystery. Did he approach Brentano and ask him to supervise, and Brentano rejected him? We don't know what happened. But Brentano disappeared, and gradually over time we get all of these disparaging comments by Freud about philosophy. He's constantly knocking philosophy and philosophers. He's dismissing philosophers basically as schizoid intellectuals, people whose minds are turned away from reality narcissistically on themselves. They overvalue their intellectual processes. He's constantly knocking them. But before long, he ends up doing a kind of philosophy himself, about civilization, about religion. But Brentano disappears. My point is that Freud had to know a fair amount about Hegel and dialectical thinking, because Freud's thinking is dialectical thinking. That's what this idea of the compromise formation it is. Thesis, antithesis, the synthesis, the third thing that is irreducible to the two forces that went into it. And that's the symptom. That's the dream. The dream, the symptom, the slip of the tongue. So I want to say I love you, but in order to do that, I have to repress my desire to say I hate you. So I might actually get it out. I love you, I say awkwardly, because in order to get those words out, I have to be careful not to say I hate you. That's case one. Case two, I slip and say I hate you. Oops, I mean I love you. the repressed has taken over. The third is the most interesting. I say, I late you. I mean, I love you. So there's the L of the love and the ATE of the hate, and that's a compound. That's a slip. That's a compromise formation, right? And that's the model, really, for the dream and for the symptom. And this is conflict theory. And despite the differences between the Freudians and the Lacanians, they have more in common than they have what separates them, because they're conflict theorists. And that's important. So we're talking about dream theory, and basically Freud then applies this to slips, and then he applies it to myths, manifest, latent. Then he applies it to literature. Then we apply it to cinema. So I'll tell you about my reaction to that magnificent but horrible film by Ridley Scott, Alien 1. The subsequent Aliens were by other directors. They weren't good, but this was a work of art. So the astronauts arrive on this planet, and there's this dead spaceship, and they go into the spaceship, and they go down into the... And Glenn Gabbard and his brother, who's a film scholar, did a Lacanian analysis of this film. The spaceship is the mother's body, and they go down, and there's this gurgling lab kind of like garden, and one astronaut puts his face near one of these pods, and this thing comes out of the pod, and it smashes through his faceplate and goes down his throat. And he seems to be, they take him back, he seems to be okay. They're having dinner, and suddenly he starts rumbling, and this thing smashes through his chest cage and scuttles off into the ship. And the rest of the film is about the astronauts hunting this alien, which as the film goes on, it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. The Gabbards interpret this in Kleinian pre-Oedipal terms about the mother and blah, 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 part objects, paranoid, schizoid, da-da-da-da. Very plausible, and I bought it, and then I went back and saw the film a number of times, and then suddenly I began to see a much deeper, but ironically Oedipal interpretation of the film. I suddenly realized, you see, the computer that runs the ship and that is linked to the authorities back on Earth is called Mother. And the astronauts are horrified to discover that Mother wants them to not kill the alien, but bring it home to Earth. This is the astronauts are the older siblings who are horrified that Mother wants the baby brought home from the hospital. They want to kill the baby. You have to protect newborns from the older kids. They'll flush it down the toilet. They'll throw it out the window. The astronauts are older siblings who want to kill the new sibling. And they're the ones who are murderous, but their murderousness is projected onto the alien, which is turning into this giant murderous monster as the embodiment of their murderousness. Okay? So that's getting from the manifest to the latent level of interpretation of a film.
Yes.
So Freud applies this to literature, film, the psychoanalytic session. This is psychoanalytic thinking. We try to get behind the manifest to the latent. Listening with the third ear. People who don't do it aren't doing psychoanalysis, in my opinion. They're doing something else. They're doing supportive psychotherapy, they're doing CBT, and I'm not knocking supportive psychotherapy, and I'm not knocking CBT. There is a place for these kinds of psychotherapy, but they're not psychoanalytic, in my opinion. This is the essence of psychoanalytic listening. It's trying to get at what's unconscious, what's latent. Okay, Freud produces this model of the mind. This is Freud's topographic model of the mind, and he worked with this until 1923, and then he continued to work with it, although he changed it substantially in 1923, as we'll see next week. Up here on the surface is conscious. This is an open border. My phone number is pre-conscious. If you ask for it, I bring it up, and then I'll let it drop back when I'm not interested, but this is voluntary. It's a matter of attention. Here's the censorship barrier, the repression barrier is here. Here we have the unconscious. Freud recognized a division within the unconscious between the triangular Oedipal layer and the dyadic triad-dyad, the dyadic pre-Oedipal layer. And this is what Melanie Klein also recognizes as the difference between D and PS. D stands for depressive position, PS stands for paranoid schizoid position. Freud mapped the triadic Oedipal layer pretty darn thoroughly. This is the area of neurosis. People who are operating mainly in the depressive position, they're pretty sane. Folks, they've achieved the depressive position. They suffer from ambivalence conflict because they've achieved ambivalence. They're no longer splitting very much. We all split a bit, but they're pretty good at overcoming splitting. But that puts them into a whole new set of problems, namely ambivalence conflict, which is what neurosis is. So that my loving is constantly hampered by my hating. And damn it, my hating is hampered by my loving. I can't get a good hate going because I love too much. I can't get a good love going because I hate too much. I'm tripping over my own feet. That's neurotic. That's Woody Allen stuff. They've reached the depressive position. Freud maps the Oedipal pretty thoroughly. But he knows there's this pre-Oedipal. Now, of course, his bias shows in the very term pre-Oedipal. It's foreplay. It's not the main event. The main event for Freud is the Oedipus. Pre-Oedipal. Klein takes it far more seriously. It's not pre, it's a substance in its own right. And mother is not just a target of Oedipal desire. Mother is mother. She's the first other. She's also my first boss. My first tyrant. And there are all kinds of problems that are rooted in the early mother-child relationship long before we get to the Oedipus complex. Now Freud likened the depressive position, the triangle layer, to the Greco-Roman. So he says you start digging in one of those modern Italian cities, and you get down below the Italian town, and you're into the Greco-Roman ruins from that earlier civilization. But if you keep digging, below the Greco-Roman ruins are Minoan Mycenaean ruins from an even earlier civilization. And he said the pre-Oedipal is like the Minoan Mycenaean. The Greco-Roman worshipped the father gods. The Minoan Mycenaean worshipped female deities. He knew this was there, but he was a patriarchal male. And he said that this remained a dark continent for him. He said it was all gray and shadowy. He said it will be the women analysts who tell us about it. He was quite right. Melanie Klein, his daughter Anna Freud, many others. Now, why would they map it for us? Because they're women. How do psychoanalysts learn about the mind? Through transference. And he was quite comfortable being the recipient of father transferences, because that fit his gender identity. But he was very uncomfortable with patients who tried to turn him into a breast, or a womb, or a mother. So he said it will be the women analysts, Melanie Klein, Anna Freud, who would fill this in. And they did. Okay, so this is kind of mapping Klein onto Freud. Depressive position, paranoid schizoid position.
Question?
Yes, sure. Get the mic.
So you talked about how it would be therapeutic to uncover like somebody's repression of their anger, for instance, and that, you know, exploring the
or sexual feelings that they're having that they don't know where they're coming from exactly.
Yeah. But then there's this other stream, which is this apparent universal structure of, you know, that everybody has this Oedipus complex.
That's just what I'm turning to here next.
So we all have that. So why don't we just tell everybody you have this, and that would just free us all.
Well, why don't I just hand the patient a book at the beginning of that? Because that's purely intellectual.
Okay.
I mean, that doesn't change anything. Freud was well aware that there's a huge difference between intellectual understanding and emotional understanding. I mean, nowadays we talk about IQ and EQ, emotional intelligence, I mean, it helps. If the patient has read a book about psychoanalysis before they start, well, they're going to use it as resistance, but it's probably going to be more help than anything else because they already got a sense of what psychoanalysis is, and so it's going to help probably that they know a little bit about psychoanalysis before we start, but it's certainly not going to solve anything. Freud said, first of all, he made the joke about self-analysis. Karen Horney wrote a whole book called Self-Analysis, by the way, and some analysts have made you can go a certain distance. One analyst made a self-analysis using what he called his, I forget what the term was, his shivering. Like you're in the shower and you suddenly have a thought of something you said to someone at the party and you shiver. Oh my God, did I actually say that? Oh, a little shiver of embarrassment. Or you're shaving, you're looking at yourself in the mirror and you think of something that just makes you twinge a little bit. This analyst decided to study those. I kept a journal of all of those little experiences, and it led into a kind of a little interesting self-analysis. So I'm not knocking self-analysis altogether, but Freud's joke was that the trouble with it is that the countertransference is too strong, meaning you are the analyst as well as the patient. And the countertransference, your love for the patient, in other words, your narcissism is way too strong. So you're not going to look at the very things that are the things that need to be looked at. We cannot see the back of our own heads without a whole mirror thing happening. We can't. And that's why no analysis reaches the bottom. I mean, we can always benefit from it. Freud recommended that the analyst go back into analysis every 5 years, and some actually do. Others, unfortunately, take umbrage at the thought that they should, as if that means that somehow they're deficient. No, it doesn't mean you're deficient. It just means you have an unconscious, which is bottomless. There will always be important things about yourself that you're not seeing that another person can see and can help you see. That's just the way we are, right? You can make progress in analysis. You can get to know yourself better and better, but you never reach the end of it. So no, you can't the intellectual understanding just doesn't cut it. It's when it gets replayed with the analyst. Well, you could read and you could have memories about your hatred of your father, but now you're hating your analyst, who never has done anything to you. But that same hatred of your father who's been dead for years, now you want to strangle this man who's your analyst. It's coming to life in the room with the analyst. This is very different than reading a book about your psyche. See what I mean? So let's talk about the Oedipus. Freud has a glimpse of it when he wakes up in the compartment and there's his naked mother and there's the old father taking her into the next compartment. It's like those stories of the dragon who hauls off the maiden and takes her into a cave, and Lancelot or someone is going to come and rescue her from the monster. Well, the old man is the monster and the maiden is the mother, and you, Lancelot. So here we have this eternal triangle, this threesome. And it's more complicated in women because we all, first of all, fall in love with our mothers. Now, of course, we love our mothers. That's not what Freud's Oedipus complex is about. But at about 2.5, we fall in love with her. Doesn't matter whether you're a girl or a boy. You fall in love with your mother. Now, there's a difference. The girl has fallen in love with a female, and she's a female. And the male has fallen in love with a female. So for her, it's kind of homoerotic, and for him, it's heterosexual. If she's going to become a heterosexual woman, she has to somehow disentangle herself from her first love. And that gives a lot of problems to a lot of women because they feel that in loving men, they've betrayed their mother. They feel disloyal to their mother by switching over and starting to desire men. And you know, the feminists in the 60s got it all wrong when they said that Freud just took the male as the model and said it with women it's the same, only in reverse. And that is, they hadn't read Freud. If they had, they'd know that isn't true. Because if Freud had done that, he would have said, he would have bought into the idea of an Electra complex. The boy falls in love with his mother, Oedipus. The girl falls in love with her father, Electra. No, that's not the way it is. The girl falls in love with her mother. How then the hell does she get from the love of the mother to the love of the father? Freud puzzles about that throughout the 1920s. He realizes female psychology is much more complicated in certain ways than male psychology is. Only if you look at it from an identification, you see, from the standpoint of object, the girl's got a second problem. She's got to detach herself from her first object if she's going to become heterosexual, and switch over to the second object, the father. The boy has to change his identifications, because his first identification is with the mother, the first object. That's a female identification. Men have to live down their primary feminine identifications. Men have to disidentify from mother.
That's right.
So therefore Odysseus has to go off and do all these tests and conquer all of these, pass all these challenges and so on, and men have to climb mountains and prove, you know, that they're men. Because secretly, there's that feminine identification. A man is never sure he's a man. He always has doubts. And that's why he's got to be proving it all the time. So men have to change their identifications. Women, if they're going to be heterosexual, and there's no reason why they have to be, but if they are going to be, they have to switch. Okay, so it takes a different shape, but Freud and Freudians insist that in all times, all cultures, that this is universal, this Oedipal triangle. The jealousy towards the rival, the envy of the rival, the wish to get rid of the rival. So my son, when he's at about 3, so my wife and I are across from each other at the table trying to have some conversation over dinner, and he's in his high chair at the side. And as long as I'm looking at him, and as long as she's looking at him, everything's fine. But when we turn our eyes away from him and we start looking at each other, it starts to get noisy over here. Milk gets spilled, food is flying, until we turn back to looking at him again. And so then I'm going off for a conference in New York, and no doubt in his mind, thank God, the old monster's going away, and I've got Mama all to, and maybe his plane will crash, and I'll be done with him forever. But he made it to the depressive position, so the thing is he loves me too. So he's running after me as I go out to the cab. Daddy, don't forget to take your vitamins. Okay, because he loves me. And he hates me. That's the ambivalence conflict. That's what Oedipal conflict is. It's totally false to say that the Oedipus complex is you love one parent and you hate the other as a rival. That is a gross oversimplification. The rival, you are ambivalent towards the rival. You both love and hate the rival, and that's where the whole poignancy of the Oedipal problem comes in. Find yourself hating someone you love. It's very problematic. So the question is it universal? Are the Freudians right to say that between 2.5 and 5 we all encounter this? You know, silly old Jean-Paul Sartre claimed never to have had an Oedipus complex because his father died when he was 1, and he was raised by his mother in her father's home. And he thought because the father wasn't around, he therefore did not have an Oedipus complex. No, he had a doozy of Oedipus complex precisely because his father wasn't around. And he had his mother all to himself until she finally got herself, she finally remarried, and he hated the man that she married. And he confessed later on in his life that he always had this attraction to incest. He ended up living with his mother for like quite a number of years towards the end of his life. Okay, the father doesn't have, you can have an Oedipus complex whether there's a father on the scene or not. Now here is where Jacques Lacan makes a profound contribution, because he distinguishes between the literal father and what he calls the name of the father, which is the function, the paternal function. And therefore the paternal function is the function of a third who interferes and says no. So a single mother who's raising her son, and the son wants to be in the bedroom when she's undressing her. He wants to be in the bathroom with her, and she says no, and she closes the door. Well, his father is the door that's closed. Or he wants her to stay home with him, but she's going out to a movie with her girlfriend. Well, the girlfriend is the father, because the girlfriend is the third who's taking her away from him. So the Oedipal third is what we're talking about here. The rival, the door, the boundary. That is what the paternal function is. It's a boundary that says, no, you can't touch me there. You can't be with me in this way. This is not for you. Well, I won't go into, don't need to go further, but I mean, Lacan distinguishes similarly. He metaphorizes Freud in a way that unfortunately Freud fell into a kind of literalism. Freud said women can't have castration anxiety because they don't have a penis to lose. He said men can't have penis envy because why would you envy what you've already got? Now, of course, this is nonsense because Lacan says it's not about the penis, it's about the phallus. And men are full of penis envy. I see more penis envy in men than I've ever seen in women. Guys envy the bigger cars, the bigger houses. If you're an academic man, the bigger curriculum vitae. We're constantly comparing. Men are constantly engaged in a pissing contest with other men. And that's all about the phallus envy. Women are filled with castration anxiety because women identify the phallus with that which, if they really take pride in their intellect, then, like Alzheimer's or any kind of senility, would be a nightmare because all of their power is invested in their mind. Some women invest the phallus in their beauty. And so they get into their late 40s and 50s, and the lines are showing up, so that's castration. The woman who was killed by the Manson family, Sharon Tate, she had these amazing, beautiful breasts. They were insured for millions. Some actresses insure their legs for millions. These are phallus. So the phallus is that which enables me to attract desire. And here Lacan also makes an important contribution. He says that human desire is the desire of the other. In other words, I desire to be desired. See, Lacan reinterprets Freud through narcissism. The Oedipus is fundamentally a narcissistic project. It's a desire to be the center. It's a desire to be the apple of the other's eye. The other can be mother, could be father, doesn't matter. We want to be desired. Okay, and so let's talk about the Oedipus. Is it universal? So, Bronislaw Malinowski was an anthropologist who got trapped in the Trobriand Islands when the First World War broke out, and he couldn't get out. And so he decided to spend his whole time there doing a detailed ethnography of Trobriand culture. And it's a matrilocal and a matrilineal culture. That is, one traces one's descent through the mother's side, and when you marry, you go to live in the man goes to live in his wife's village. Okay? And the husband is a nobody in his wife's village. Because the real important figure in the wife's village is her brother. And her brother is responsible for raising her children. And the brother is the authority figure for her children, and the brother is her protector. And the husband visits from his own village because he's a big deal back in his own village because there he's a maternal uncle. Okay, but in her village he's kind of a nobody, and she easily divorces him. And so the Trobriand boy doesn't have any hostility towards his father, although his father is the one who has intercourse with his mother. His hostility is towards his maternal uncle, who has authority over him. Okay? So the Marxists all pounced on this and said, see, Freud and Freudians are wrong. It's not about sex. It's about power. It's about authority, they all said. No. Anne Parsons, the great sociologist Talcott Parsons' daughter, she goes back and carefully reviews all of Malinowski's field data, and it turns out that Trobriand culture is filled with jokes and taboos about brothers and sisters, sniggling jokes about brothers and sisters who are having it off in the bushes. And when a brother and a sister pass on the path, one of them has to jump off the path into the jungle. They can't be alone together. This is a culture obsessed with the possibility of brother-sister incest. Why? Because the brother is the most important man in her life. The culture puts them together. So then look at this from the boy's point of view. Dad, who has intercourse with mom, is no real threat at all. He wants to be the center of his mother's life, but that's his uncle. So it is about jealousy. The Freudians are right after all, but they're wrong. It's not about sex. It's not about who has intercourse with who. It's about who loves who most. It's about who's most important to most. So let's talk about the French. The bourgeois French. Okay? So let's talk about Mitterrand's funeral. Okay? At his funeral, there's his legitimate wife and his legitimate daughter, and there's his lifelong mistress and his daughter with the mistress. And this is a state occasion. And they're all there together. Because in France, bourgeois middle-class men have mistresses. And bourgeois married women have lovers. And it's kind of accepted. But like from her point of view, it's only he can have his mistresses as long as he comes home to mama. And he's okay with her having her boy toys as long as she comes home to papa. That's the way they look at it. It's kind of like, and so what does Anne Parsons conclude? That the Freudians are both right and wrong. They're right. There is a universal jealousy complex. We will always desire one person and feel the other as the rival. There will be always this triangle. There will always be this rivalry. There will always be this jealousy. But the kinship arrangements of the local culture will determine how that plays out. Okay, so the Oedipus complex is not about sex particularly. Now in our culture, it's double dose because father is the most important man in mother's life and he sleeps with her. Okay, so this jealousy thing, this triangle is unavoidable. And you'll see it wherever you go. And it comes with attachment. I mean, let's bring John Bowlby in here, and we're primates, and primates form attachments. We're innately programmed to form attachments. And primates get very attached. And when you're really attached, you want that person all to yourself. And you don't want to share. Yeah. The microphone?
So why this pursuit of like a universal kind of experience around relationships and jealousies, but there aren't, you don't accept universal explanations for dreams, for instance? Like, why aren't there universal explanation symbols for dreams, but there are universal kind of structures around jealousies, sexuality, and all that?
To deny the universality of symbolic meaning doesn't mean that I'm denying all universals. I mean, some universals, it seemed to me, do exist and some don't. I just think that the claim about universal symbolism happens to be false. I don't see any evidence. I just think that the way meaning works is much more multiple than that. But I don't deny. I believe in certain human universals. My original training is as a sociologist, and sociologists and anthropologists got heavily into a massive cultural relativism. And of course, Foucault made it worse to an absurd degree. I mean, Chomsky was sensible enough back in the 1950s against the radical relativists and constructivists who went crazy with language. Chomsky says, language is rooted in the brain, in innate brain structures that cultures fill in different ways. One of the brilliant things about Erich Fromm, there's an Erich Fromm revival going on now, okay? And this is what separates Fromm from Adorno and Horkheimer and those other critical theorists. Fromm took from Karl Marx, and this is not the young Marx, this is the old Marx. He took the idea that there's a distinction between human nature in general and human nature as it is expressed in particular historical and cultural circumstances. So Marx did not rule out the idea of human nature. He was quite sensitive to the idea that sometimes capitalist man is celebrated as universal man, and that's false historically. So that's essentialism, and we need to get past that. But we need to come back to the idea that there is a universal human nature. Fromm has what he calls a qualified essentialism. Of course, the way human nature, universal human nature is expressed is going to depend on the historical and social and cultural circumstances. But there still is a core of a human condition that creates a problem for all of us across cultures.
No, but I'm going to figure out that I'm going to be attracted to a woman just like a cricket might do the same thing. I mean, it doesn't require a lot of cortical kind of processes for that.
Right.
It seems like I'm going to be attracted to a woman or a man, and that's just biologically predetermined. It's fairly simple.
Yes.
But all these conflicts seem like they could be more a response to different environmental things. Like, why should those things be that universal?
Well, what are we saying is universal? I'm with Ann Parsons on this, and I'm saying what's universal is the desire to monopolize the love. I think that it's a part of human nature and part of the child's nature to want to be the only one. Look, anyone who falls in love knows what I'm talking about. You go crazy when you think she's looking at someone else.
What would you say about the paranoiac father who Oedipalizes the son? Is that a possibility at all?
Oh, totally. Well, that's an environmental circumstance. I mean, okay, I'll repeat the question, Michael. The question was, what about the paranoiac father who Oedipalizes the son? Look, we all have this desire to be central, and therefore we will always resent the rival parent, and the siblings, by the way. Don't think that the Oedipus is just about parents and children. The siblings are our Oedipal rivals. Remember the film Alien. We want to get rid of the siblings as well as the rival parent. We want to have the object all to ourselves. Okay, that's inevitable. But now we've got a father who loves to castrate his sons. Puts them down, belittles them, makes jokes about their tiny penis, whatever. That's going to make things way worse. What about the mother who is Yocasta? The incestuously seductive mother. I've had a number of patients whose mothers were so completely seductive towards their sons that the sons had to resort to extreme measures to avoid actual physical incest with their mothers, which their mothers were inviting. And that's crazy making in a big time way. So do the parents' actual behaviors make a difference? Of course. They either inflame it or they help it. Okay, let's talk about the father who doesn't make it worse by, say, being castrating towards the son, but he observes his little boy having designs on his mother and wanting to push him out of bed, and the father smiles. Okay, my guy's turning into a little man, a little phallic guy, a little competition with me, he's a chip off the old block, good for you, son. You smile about it. You don't get into a rivalry with the kid, but you realize this is a stage, and you're happy with this development, and it's cool, right? But another father is going to be so threatened by this that he's going to start a war with his son.
Sure.
Yeah. So there's no denial of the individual variations in these things, but there's a core of universality which is affected, I think. Of all of the writers in psychoanalysis, I think Erich Fromm navigates this. Well, he's very Hegelian. He occupies a third position, like the nature-nurture conflict. Is it nature and biology? Is it nurture and the social environment? Is it social construction? Is it biology? Fromm says it's both biology and it's environment, but there's also a human condition, an existential situation. We are human beings who have one foot in nature and one foot outside it. We're immersed in nature by our bodies, but we have this peculiarly symboling mind, this symbolic consciousness. We have language, and we have self-consciousness. We are aware of ourselves. And we're lonely in this universe, which is why we populate it with gods. So we have got some company, because we've awakened and in ways that other animals are lived by nature. They're immersed in nature. But we have slipped outside nature while being still in it. And this self-awareness that leads to a kind of existential loneliness, and it creates problems that we have to somehow navigate. And Fromm tries to study the different strategies, this different solutions people try to put together to cope with this existential problem that we all have. I'm really pleased that people are starting to pay attention to Erich Fromm again. I mean, Adorno and Horkheimer did a hatchet job on Fromm, and he was dismissed as a simplistic popularizer for decades. Finally, people are coming back to him. It's very welcoming. So that's about the Oedipus complex. Yes, you're on the microphone.
I'm wondering if I misheard a little bit, because at the very beginning, for about 2 minutes, things started to get weird to me.
Oh, okay.
And then they came
About
back
what?
up. Just saying that Freud associated conscious with the body, and you kept using the word evil with that, which seemed to be something that I had never found in Freud, that the morals.
Oh, no. Okay. Can I clarify?
Sure.
All I meant is that, forget the word evil, I'm not invested in that. What I meant is that Freud sees human destructiveness as a manifestation of an aggressive drive that is rooted in the body. Okay, he quotes the Roman playwright Titus Machias Plautus, homo homini lupus est. Man is a wolf unto man. And I say that's very unfair to the wolves, because they're a very social species. We are vicious. And Freud blames our viciousness on the animal in us. It isn't true. It's what's uniquely human about us that's vicious. It's because we have an ego, and because we got a superego. That's where our viciousness comes from. So I just think he got it backwards.
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah, sure.
Because I think I heard you say too that you would have preferred if Freud had let go of the body and said, no, it's all a mind thing. Some of us, and let me say, are coming back to Freud because we admire his insistence on keeping the mind attached to the body. And the expression that I keep remembering about Freud is psychic representations of somatic drive.
Right.
And I thought it was very precise there.
Oh, he was
Something I
very
liked
precise.
very much.
That's how he defined the instinct. He says the instinct is a representation in the mind of a of an insistent thing rooted in the body. He called it a frontier concept between mind and body. I think he's profoundly wrong about that. You think he's profoundly right about that. We got a big disagreement here.
Yeah.
Maybe we can talk about why you think that's a useful concept. I just don't find it useful, and I have zero interest in the field of neuropsychoanalysis, for one thing, because I am no more interested in the brain than I am in what's under the hood of my car. I leave that to other people. I drive the car. When it breaks down, I take it to the mechanic, let him fix it. I know the brain is important. I know it's involved in all of our behavior. I'm just not interested in it because I'm interested in meaning. And that's what I think psychoanalysis is fundamentally about. It's about the narratives that make up our minds. Of course there's something under the hood. Of course. I just don't find it interesting, personally.
Are you interested in dance?
I love to dance.
Can there be meaning through dance? Through
Oh,
the body?
absolutely. But you see, that's another form of symbolism. I mean, Suzanne K. Langer wrote this book about the linguistic turn back in the 1940s, and she said that social scientists, when they think about meaning, they've gotten too much concerned with discursive meaning. But there is non-discursive symbolism. Mime, dance, music. These are all non-discursive symbol systems. So, as a symbol system, of course, dance, liturgy, all of these symbol systems, but they're stories. They're symbolic. They're symbolic systems. Now, of course, in order to be able to produce these symbolic systems, we need to have a brain of a very sophisticated sort, and we need to have a cortex, and so on. But that's the analog. That's the underlying. But up here on the level of meaning is what I'm interested in. Interpreting the symbol systems. We wouldn't have the symbol systems if we didn't have a brain capable of generating. Yeah. So I'm not an anti-materialist, or of course all of this meaning rests in a biological process. It's just that I think that Freud's way of conceiving, say, of sexuality as bubbling up from the body is completely backwards. I mean, you know, if you look at animal studies, the scientists who study animals, at the bottom of the phylogenetic hierarchy are the unicellular organisms, and then you come up to the invertebrates, and then the vertebrates, and then the mammals, and then you get to the primates. And the lower down, the more the behavior is controlled by automatic, innate, instinctive processes, and the higher you go up, the less anything biological is controlling it, until you get up to man, where the sexuality has very little biological input. Women are a little more receptive to sex at a certain point of their menstrual cycle, but that's about it, and that can be overcome, I find, with perfume and flowers. So, you know, there's there's not a lot of the biological. I think when it comes to human sexuality, it's symbolism and stories and imagery and all of that kind of thing. Yeah, but this gentleman was trying to ask something. It can wait till next week. Okay, I guess you'll have to be the last. We're 5 after.
So is psychoanalysis concerned with kind of healthy development or some sort of normal development, of which Oedipus complex is an example, and then how that gets disrupted in various ways, and then trying to bring it back to that?
Well, the Oedipus complex is a system of emotions and problems. In the theory of the Oedipus complex, the way I've been talking, I'm just talking about the universality of the desire to be number one, and the hostility you feel to the people who get in the way of you being number one. I'm not saying how this should get resolved. I'm not saying it should get resolved heterosexually. I'm not saying it should get resolved homosexually. I'm not saying how it should get resolved. I mean, I do believe that it should get resolved in a way that allows you to be an adult, functioning sexual person. It should get resolved in a way that allows you not to be sexually crippled, so that you can enjoy a sex life of whatever kind. A lot of people they don't get out of the Oedipus without being way too sexually repressed. They cannot allow themselves to enjoy themselves in the bedroom. Or their sexuality is warped in all kinds of ways, so that it goes to places that it shouldn't go to, like towards children, for example. These are pathological outcomes. But But in terms of, I'm not very narrow in trying to push ideas of what the normal looks like. That varies widely from person to person, well, in France, things are normal that aren't normal. In Toronto. Okay, we'll see you next week.